Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to another episode of the Talkroom series of podcasts, where we look at the question of how to be your best self. We do this by looking at mental health and well-being and how this applies to people's lives. For those people who have yet to hear our previous podcasts, I would like to give a warm introduction to my co-presenter, Ian. Ian is a senior accredited member of the National Counselling Society and the founder of Hope Therapy and Counselling Services. So a warm welcome to you, Ian.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you. That's really kind of you. And to introduce you, a highly experienced CBT psychotherapist with well over 30 years of experience working with mental health and well-being more generally. So an absolute delight to have you here once again, Wendy. And a welcome back to Simon, our co-host for this evening and guest. Simon joined us for the previous podcast on death anxiety. So an absolute pleasure to have you back. For those that haven't had an opportunity to listen, people might like to go back and take a look at that. Simon is a member of the Hope team, also a very sought after person-centered counsellor as well, and also a very prolific blogger. So an absolute pleasure to have you with us once again, Simon.
Thank you for having me back, Ian. So when you first invited me to come on the podcast, you asked if there are any topics I'd like to speak on. And my first thoughts were autism, but then I had a listen to your previous podcast on autism and thought it was really excellent. And so then I was puzzling, what would I like to speak of? How can I use a different angle? And I thought it'd be interesting to explore sensory sensitivities, specifically looking at three examples. So firstly, sensory processing disorder. Secondly, tinnitus. And thirdly, selective attention.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Simon. That's really interesting. It sounds very relevant and a very important topic for our listeners, I must say. But I do realise that seven of them might not be aware of what sensory sensitivities are, or that different people may actually sense the world differently. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about generally what you mean by these terms.
Yes, yeah. So when I say sensory sensitivities, I'm talking about sensing things that others cannot, or an intensity that's either much more or less than a typical person. So as well as SPD, tinnitus, and selective attention, we could also include other areas like hallucinations, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, cognitive distractions and time perception in ADHD, or the sensations of a panic attack. What we're talking about really is hidden conditions that we might experience but aren't obvious to other people. And then we can wrestle with our sensitivities not getting diagnosed and treated, or even really being believed.
So thank you for those really interesting explanation there, Simon. I wonder if you can just help our audience just to empathize a little bit more with what having a sensory sensitivity might actually be like.
Yeah. Let's have a go at role playing. Let's do some scenarios, and maybe that can enhance our empathy. And let's play a game where we do this as well. So I'm going to go through some scenarios and have a think. Which one do you think's tinnitus? Which one's sensory processing disorder? And which one's selective attention? Okay, scenario 1. Imagine you're visiting an elderly relative and you decide to watch a show together. They put the telly on, but then they turn the volume up to 80. It's so loud, it's like a TV set screaming at you. You can't concentrate on the show at all. The volume's deafening. You scold your relative, putting your hands over your ears, demanding they turn it down. Use your hearing aids, you scream at them. At first they don't hear you, so you shout all the louder, swearing at them this time to grab their attention. Your ears, they're physically hurting from the volume. Your relative looks back at you, confused, embarrassed, slightly offended. They do adjust the volume, they put their hearing aids in, but later that evening they have a discussion with you about your behaviour and how you were wrong because you swore at them. So have a go, listener. Is that SPD? Is that tinnitus, or is it selective attention? And holding that in your mind, I'll move on to another scenario. Picture you come home from work and you notice the low hum of an electrical appliance. It's a static-like noise, and you can tell that something's switched on somewhere, but you're not sure where it is. You ask others in your household, what's that noise? And they say there isn't one. They don't seem bothered by it, actually. But you are. You search that house for 20 minutes, desperately trying to prove them wrong and gain some control over this incessant humming. You listen to every ruddy electrical appliance in the house, and you question, is this real? Am I imagining it? And then eventually, you find a faulty phone charger, and you switch it off. The humming stops. But your flatmates don't care. In fact, they actually seem annoyed at you because you suggest they replace the charger. Scenario 3. Okay, tomorrow's going to be a busy day. You've got an exam first thing in the morning. You really need your sleep, and you lay down in bed and try to drift off that anxious mind of yours. It's hard to relax, but you notice there's so much background noise. First, your alarm clock, it's ticking loudly. There's a party down the street and they're selfishly playing music. Moonlight's flickering in through a tiny crack in the curtains, and to make matters worse, your feet are still cold. You try to practice some relaxation exercises. You count, you do mindfulness, but the more you try and tune out this background noise, the louder it becomes. The next day, you're angry, shattered. You struggle to concentrate in that exam.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. That was really helpful to normalize and connect more with what those conditions might feel like. And also why sensory sensitivities, they're such an important area to be aware of and get support around. I have an idea of which one is which, but maybe you could tell us as we cover those 3 different topics. You mentioned the first one was SPD, which is sensory processing disorder. Could you tell us a little bit more about what this is?
Yes, I might also now abbreviate it to SPD because sensory processing disorder, I get a bit tongue-tied with it. That was a scenario of a TV volume and swearing at our relative. So Spectrum News, they quote that SPD affects about 15% of the general population. However, it affects 90% of autistic children. When I say SPD, I'm talking about when our senses are either under or oversensitive relative to a neurotypical person. And a person will seek to reach a place of regulation with each of the senses, not overly stimulated, not understimulated. And behaviour can be seen as us moving to a position of sensory regulation, even if that behaviour is unexpected, like us screaming at our relative. And SPD can affect all of the senses, and a person might be hypersensitive in some areas and then hyposensitive in others. Part of the work with autism is creating a sensory profile unique to the individual's sensory experience, something that may have been done at assessment with a OT, but also something that you as the listener could consider for each of your senses. When we've done this, when we have an idea of our sensory profile, we can have a little think about making environments more inclusive, adaptions that we can put in to protect against overstimulation, communicating our sensory needs to others, gaining a sense of control, or strategies to realize and explain when we've experienced sensory overwhelm, commonly called meltdown, and reflect how we could maybe have some more control over meltdowns in the future.
Thank you, Simon. That was fascinating. And you mentioned this over or under sensitivity, and how it can affect all of the senses. And I wonder if you could just unpack that and just explain a little bit more about what that might look like for a person with SPD.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It's really unique to the individual, but maybe I could break down some of the senses. And imagine if you were over or under sensitive in each of them, what you'd need to do to regulate yourself, regulate your sensory needs. So firstly, touch. Touch is quite a few different senses around things like pain, pressure, texture, and temperature. It affects things like our physical comfort, contact, how comfortable we feel with clothes if they rub, and how hard we like our food. Taste is a combination of both our taste buds in the tongue and mouth, but it also combines well with smell. It affects how pungent we find food, any spices or flavorings we might add to our food, and you can even taste smells. Food is quite complex. It's a combination between lots of different senses, and dietary issues like pica, ARFID, or eating disorders can make a lot more sense when we understand a person's sensory profile. Smell affects our smell. It's about our tolerance to odors around us. Oversensitivity can result in gag reflexes, can be quite visceral, or intolerances to chemical smells. And understimulation might result in us just not noticing our body odor, could affect our hygiene. Vision concerns seeing fluid movement, depth perception, and sensitivities to brightness. It can create distractions if there's movements. It can create sensitivities even to bright colors, like my orange background here. Um, Intolerance towards sunlight, and we might need to use our mobile phone before bed if we're understimulated to regulate us. Hearing affects our hearing of both our internal systems and also external noises. It can cause noise sensitivities that actually physically hurt the ear. It can cause us to notice sounds that others don't, like that electrical device or the beating of our heart. It can affect how much we filter out background conversations and the volume at which we speak. Conversely, hyposound might mean that we don't notice dangers like a car horn going. Proprioception, that's a new one. Proprioception is our awareness of our body, for example, the limbs, in space. It affects fine motor coordination, force and pressure, and our personal space. And proprioceptive sensitivities can result in accidentally bumping into things, stomping, hyperextending the limbs, which can result in muscle tears, and difficulty with fine motor control, like handwriting. This vestibular system, it controls our sense of balance within the inner ear. It affects motion sickness, balance and dizziness, and the ability to perform physical movements. Hypovestibular sensitivities might be soothed by if we rock or move a lot when we're distressed. Pain can be external, like the time it takes to pull your hand away from a hot stove. It can also be internal, around noticing when we have pains like toothache and attributing our toothache to pain. Hyperpain sensitivities might cause a vivid awareness of pain, resulting in us going to the GP more often, and maybe people might call us things because we're going to the GP a lot. Interoception, it's actually it's a whole host of senses, but it's around sensing and noticing things like the temperature internally and externally, if we're hungry or thirsty, tiredness, how exhausted we are if we're exercising, our time perception, and things I've mentioned before, like noticing our heartbeat or of internal pain. And lastly, very relevant for this podcast, emotions. There's actually a word, alexithmia, and the Autism Research Group estimate it affects around 50% of autistic people. Alexithmia means a difficulty identifying, noticing, regulating, regulating emotions in you and in other people. And it doesn't mean that we lack empathy. It doesn't, but it does mean that we might struggle to sense feelings. And the risk, if we struggle sensing feelings, is not noticing when we ourselves are deregulated, until it's too late. We no longer have emotional control.
That's really fascinating, and having an idea of those different senses how might a person with SPD actually go about getting support? It sounds like such an important area.
Yeah, it really is. My first suggestion, it does cost money to do, but it's worth actually getting professional sensory profiling. Many autism companies, for example, locally to me, Autism Oxford, will include it within a autism assessment. And it's done by a qualified occupational therapist that can do sensory assessments with you. And this will really specify your unique sensory profile. It might also be that it's expensive. It might also be that you want to just consider your senses individually. And I ask some really helpful questions that can guide with this on my blog. If you go to www.simonslistening.co.uk and then look at the blog post, How Your Autism Affects You worksheet. Anyway, once you're aware of your sensory profile and our sensory needs, there is support. It's not hopeless. So firstly, equipment, and that equipment can really be quite specific to a person's sensory profile. It might include things like headphones, darkened glasses, stimming toys, weighted blankets, wristbands to help with car sickness, aromatherapy tools, swivel chairs, and sensory toys. Secondly, psychoeducation. So things like zones of regulation can help us to identify how we feel and when we're dysregulated. You might get dietary advice, positive behavioural support planning to reflect what happened after we've had a meltdown, and risk planning to avoid dangers. There's a whole host of things on inclusive environments, like recognizing your rights to reasonable adaptations under the Equality Act, to representation, to planning and risk assessing to prepare for new environments. And then finally, again, specific to this podcast, therapy. So HOPE offer a wide variety of therapeutic interventions. Mindfulness can help with somatic work and filtering. My approach as a person-centered counsellor can help us to access and regulate our own unique experience, which includes our emotional experience, and that can help our empathy of others. There are also some really specific presenting issues that we might have if we have SPD. We may have been exposed to complex traumatic experiences from repeated exposure to sensory overwhelm. We might have fears or anxieties around the unpredictability of unknown environments. We might have been labelled and have judgments from neurotypical people, labelling our sensory processing as wrong or saying we're acting out. And we might experience a sense of loneliness or social exclusion because of sensory overwhelm.
Thank you, Simon. Again, a really fascinating explanation, and it really outlines the different ways a person can be supported with SPD, and how it may even involve multiple channels of support: the occupational therapy, the support work, the equipment, all of these things playing a part. And you kindly mentioned Hope Therapy, so thank you very much for that. And we have various free resources on the website specific to autism, but many other things as well. So that's www.hopeforminds.co.uk. That www.hopeforminds.co.uk. We have various members of the team, yourself, but other trained counsellors and therapists that can work with people around those specific presenting issues, such as SPD.
Mm. Yes, Simon, that's really great. And thank you for such amazing information. And I get the sense that we could use the whole episode around SPD. But I'm also conscious that you mentioned tinnitus and selective attention. And I'm just wondering which scenario is which. And I also get the sense that some of the suggestions around SPD might be helpful with other sensory sensitivities. Could you perhaps expand on that for us?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. That is the case. There are some special distinctions with some of those other conditions though, and that actually brings me quite nicely onto tinnitus, or tinnitus, however you want to say it. So tinnitus was the scenario with the humming phone charger, and it's actually what motivated my interest in SPD. Tinnitus is a ringing tone that only you can hear, although there are some physical noises in some forms of it. And I've personally suffered with it for a little over a year. I was going to play a YouTube video that makes the noise that a person might hear, but I've had some mic issues, and I actually think every person's is so unique that maybe it gives it injustice to say this is what tinnitus sounds like. But there are many different tones of tinnitus. You might hear a TV static-like noise, or you might hear a high-pitched ringing or clicking. I mentioned myself, mine's at 12,000 hertz, and I hear it more or less constantly, unless I'm asleep. The first thing I want to say with tinnitus, though, is go to your GP, especially if you're experiencing it in just one ear, or it's causing you to have suicidal thoughts, or there's a pulsating noise that you hear of your heartbeat. Tinnitus is a symptom, and it can have many different causes underneath it, including psychological causes, issues of the ear canal, hearing loss, vertigo, loud noise exposure, brain tumors, cardiovascular influences, and hormonal conditions. So you really want to see a medical professional just to have your hearing assessed and be scanned if necessary to see if there is anything underlying. Many forms of tinnitus can't be treated either, and don't actually have an identifiable cause. You just have this phantom noise in your ear, and that can really feel quite despairing.
Yes, totally agree there, Simon. And I can really see the importance of getting your tinnitus checked by a medical professional. That's a very good advice and very important. Regarding what else a person can do, what would be the next step for our listeners in way of support, would you suggest?
Yeah, so firstly, I echo that again. See your GP or an audiologist at a hearing centre. Unfortunately, there isn't a medical treatment for tinnitus. I mean, you'll read about taking vitamins like B12, avoiding caffeine or alcohol, and exercise, but there isn't a wonder drug. And with some conditions, mindfulness can help, but with tinnitus, focusing on the noise itself can actually make it worse. So any mindfulness practice you do should be focused on somatic experiences in the rest of the body rather than the ringing itself. For me personally, I find having tools has been helpful to give me a sense of control. So I carry discrete earplugs that I can pop in if things are loud, and mine's to do with glue ear. So for me, nose blowing or using this this Ottavent balloon just gives me that sense of control. For me as well, I also recognize that some environments will trigger it more than others. For example, if I spend too long with headphones on without a break. And finally, I've learned to make friends with my tinnitus. So tinnitus is often worse when we're stressed. So if a ringing's very loud, I tend to make space for myself. The main treatment, the main actual treatment for tinnitus is sound therapy, and that involves finding masking music. And if you do a search on YouTube, you can listen to noises of different hertz until you find the pitch that matches your tinnitus, and then find some masking music to cover that. For me, birdsong is very soothing. So sound therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy alongside it can be helpful. And CBT is recommended to try and reprogram your relationship with this phantom noise, and even equip you to ignore it more, or at least be less bothered and focused by it.
Yeah. Thank you again, Simon. And a mindfulness practice can be adapted to work with helping you to notice other things going on with the body outside of the tinnitus, as you say. And we have a number of trained CBT counsellors that can support you with your relationship with tinnitus. And Wendy, of course, a hugely experienced CBT psychotherapist as well.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So that does leave one more scenario. So it's the one with the background noise where someone was trying to sleep before an exam. So I'm assuming that must be the selective attention one. Simon, is it okay if you tell us a little bit more about that condition?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Wendy. I realise we're a bit pressed for time, so I'll try and quickly cover selective attention. The world is full of sensory information, and if we processed everything entirely, we'd just be overwhelmed. We wouldn't have the resources to focus. And the brain has whole systems whose sole function is to tune out background information so we can focus on a task. This is called sensory gating. I want you to imagine that you buy a house and it's next to a main road. Imagine for the first month you hear cars racing by, and then after a while you just ignore it. It doesn't register. People come over and you go, "Oh, was there a car?" You see, the brain's doing that as well, constantly. We're choosing what sensory information should and should not be brought into conscious awareness. And there are certain conditions, such as brain injury, where that sensory gating can get damaged, and suddenly it takes a lot more cognitive effort to ignore the background information, just like the ticking clock in the example when you're trying to sleep. And this lower amount of sensory gating can lead to sensory overwhelm, cognitive fatigue, and a difficulty in focusing.
And I can imagine that having a really quite a profound effect on a person if they're less able to filter out background information. So is there, I guess the question is there a way of improving our sensory gating?
Yeah, the brain exhibits something called neuroplasticity. New neural pathways can be formed post-brain injury, so selective attention issues may gradually improve. We also live in a digital age where we are inundated with digital sensory information. Just think about how much content passes our senses as we scroll through TikTok, and how many of us have an aversion to boredom or doing nothing.
Mm.
Deliberately finding low sensory environments where we're less inundated with both sensory information and content can help to regulate us. Um, I'm going to mention actually a technique, and this is helpful with cognitive fatigue, called pacing. And with pacing, what we do is we structure in regular workloads with regular breaks. Um, Analogies like spell slots or spoons have become very popular on social media to visualize this. And what it's trying to demonstrate is that we have finite resources with which to use for everyday tasks. And finally, mindfulness can also be beneficial for this, helping us to focus on a single part of our somatic experience, such as the breath. And mindfulness can also give us something we can do, a sense of control during sensory overwhelm, alongside the tools and tips that we've mentioned before.
Okay, Simon, thank you so much for that. It's been very fascinating and really interesting, and lots of content and information for the listeners to understand and to learn from. And it's been really good to get that overview of sensory sensitivities and a certain amount of empathy about how certain conditions make us sense the world differently. And I think it's also really reassuring to think about what support might be available to give to us that helps us to give us perhaps a sense of control rather than a feeling of hopelessness we can get when we feel we can't do anything about these things. So you mentioned in your website when you spoke about SPD, and I wondered if you wanted to again mention how people can get in touch with you or even other trained counsellors on the Team with Hope.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. So I'm on Facebook at Simon's Listening Counselling Services. You can also visit my website at www.simonslistening.co.uk, where I mention the autism worksheet article that goes into a bit more detail around SPD. Finally, I've started a YouTube channel called Simon's Listening. I'm working on a script this month, actually, on some lessons learned from giving up alcohol over the last 6 months. I want to plug Hope, but I noticed that actually you also have a YouTube channel, Wendy, and it really inspires me. You've got almost 100 videos just talking about your expertise as a therapist.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Simon. Yes, and the best way of getting hold of me is through my website called wendycastellino.com, and then there's lots of information there as well. But yes, you can just Google my name and things will come up, including my YouTube channel, if you want more information about general mental health services. So yeah, over to you, Simon.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for letting me mention it. I found something really inspiring and worth looking into, I think, your site. Yeah, so I mentioned being part of the team with Hope. They have counsellors across the UK. I also mentioned specialist mindfulness courses and that CBT can help with tinnitus. Well, Hope happen to run mindfulness sitting groups multiple times a week, as well as having counsellors who are trained in mindfulness, CBT, and mindfulness-based CBT. It's been really wonderful, actually, just being on the show the last 2 episodes. And Ian, as the founder, I wonder if you'd like to mention more about Hope. I realise there's such a wealth of expertise and a variety of different things the organisation does tailored to each client.
Yeah, that's really kind of you, Simon, and thank you so much for that. So, as you say, Hope has a whole team of counsellors and therapists. We work with a wide range of conditions and presentations in a whole variety of different ways. We have people, as you say, that work with mindfulness, that work with CBT. And people are very welcome to take a look at the website, www.hopefulminds.co.uk. We also have a YouTube channel. Just search for Hope Therapy and Counselling Services, and we're also on Spotify as well. We have all sorts of free resources, and we also have the wider team that are there to support people as well.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for coming on as our guest for the podcast. And I do hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. And we will be continuing with another episode exploring the topic of mental health and well-being. So thank you very much for Simon and for Ian, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.